All right, y'all, we are shifting gears out of ecosystems, biodiversity, all that stuff. We're going to focus on natural hazards and resiliency. The idea of sustainability being about the continuation of something, right? Then we have to think about sustainability in response to natural hazards, how we can reduce the risk from natural hazards, how we can respond more effectively to natural hazards, and how we can reduce vulnerability over time to those hazards. So that's what we're going to focus on for the next couple of lectures. And then instead of 3 lectures for this section, I'm going to have y'all do an activity on your own, thinking about natural hazards here in River Falls and how we can better respond to them. So I'll talk about that down the line, but right now I just want to focus on this idea of hazards, what they are, the threat that they pose, how we can respond to them more effectively. So, we have this term natural hazards, and the definition, you can read it there: events associated with normal, you'll see the asterisk there, geophysical and biological processes that can cause death, injury, loss of home, property, or income. So, really, natural processes only become hazards when they impact the human environment or the human population, right? Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, all of those things are part of the natural system. And so when they happen without people around, they're not a hazard per se. Yes, they can harm, animals, they can, harm habitats and so forth, but the natural system is adapted to those threats and responds appropriately. So it's not a hazard unless people are affected by it. Obviously, right now, we're in the midst of coronavirus, and that could be considered a natural hazard, right? I mean, it's a disease, it's a virus, it's been out in the environment, but only became a threat because of its impact on people, right? So, without people around, coronavirus wouldn't be a hazard, it would just be part of the natural system. And the intensity of the hazard may be influenced by human activities, modification of the environment. We've talked a lot about flooding and stormwater, and how human development and our patterns of development that increase impervious surfaces increase the risk from flooding. Certainly, deforestation, other activities like that contribute to more flooding. Our impact on the climate, obviously, with warming, and in the built environment, we have more heat waves because the urban environment allows for greater concentration of heat. We've reduced green space, reduced shade, increased dark surfaces, rooftops, roadways, those kinds of things are darker surfaces. They absorb more heat, and that has contributed to greater, heat waves in urban areas. It contributes to those being more harmful than they otherwise would be. So here in our region, the upper Midwest, there's a number of threats that we do face. Floods is a biggie. We every spring we have flood season essentially along the Mississippi and the St. Croix and those rivers. As the snow melts, increased spring rainfall, we see greater flooding. We're kind of used to it. We kind of expect it. We've adapted to it in many ways. It varies year to year based on snowmelt and rainfall, those kinds of things. But we can pretty much expect floods on the regular in this part of the world. There are other parts of the country that face flash floods, which is a different phenomenon. So Central Texas, where I'm from, is called Flash Flood Alley, and that's because the limestone geology and the terrain of Central Texas contributes to very rapid floodwaters because there's not a lot of soil over the limestone features to collect rainwater. So when we get these big summer thunderstorms, it can flood very quickly, and it happens, in an instant. So it's not like the floods here where the Mississippi comes up and it stays up for weeks at a time, and we have flooding for weeks. It's a day rises, floods, water passes through, and it's done. So a different different type of flooding, different type of threat. Blizzards and ice is another hazard we face here. Fire, to a lesser extent here than other parts of the world, but certainly in maybe some of the more northern regions of Wisconsin, wildfire can be an issue. Certainly, tornadoes are a threat, and heat, maybe not yet, but as the climate changes, we're seeing more threats from heat waves and the like. So we also do have to think about human-caused hazards. So terrorism is really the first one that pops into mind when we think about human-caused hazards. Um, Depletion of resources, not one we think of necessarily as a fast-moving hazard, but definitely one that is an issue we need to consider. So overfishing, we've talked about that and the impact on fisheries, and the, the collapse of some of our fisheries that we depend on for a primary source of food. And, well, if this pops up here, evidence for that can be seen in this story about a bluefin tuna. 3.1, seriously? These stupid ads. $3.1 million for a fish. That's pretty wild. And but the story itself actually talks about how this is a sign of overfishing and really the collapse of the bluefin tuna um, ecosystem, and how that's going to impact going forward. And water, we've talked about water and how that contributed to the Syrian civil war, for example, with a prolonged drought that led to farm failures that contributed to social unrest that contributed to the civil war. And the story here, I'm not going to click on it because the links are acting janky, is about really just an article talking about how water could be a source of conflict going forward. So oil spills, the BP oil spill from a few years ago, obviously an enormous disaster that caused a lot of issues with tourism and economic activity along the Gulf Coast. Certainly had an enormous impact on the ecosystem of the Gulf Coast. Things like that. Industrial accidents. I'm not going to show the video here, but it's a link to the West fertilizer plant explosion in Texas. West Texas is the name of the town, and they had a massive fire and an industrial accident, or it wasn't an accident, it was arson. Killed a bunch of people, enormous disaster and impact on that community. So those are things that we have to deal with in terms of human-caused hazards that affect larger communities. Wildfire is a natural hazard, but our patterns of development are contributing to the threat from wildfire. So we're building in more rural areas. We're building in what's called the wildland interface, which is that boundary of kind of suburban or ex-urban development and the natural environment where wildfires pose an enormous threat. And in these dispersed rural areas where we have development, it can be really hard to actually fight the fires when they do threaten homes in these areas, because they don't necessarily have central water systems, they don't have fire hydrants, they don't have adequate fire departments, right? They're usually volunteer fire departments in these rural areas, and they don't have the capacity to fight these wildfires that are threatening homes. So again, our patterns of development make threats worse. And then invasive species. Those are oftentimes caused by human activity. We talked about how water and ship ballasts has moved zebra mussels and other waterborne creatures around the globe, creating invasive species issues. Other human activity, landscaping plants that we've used in our gardens and in our landscape can escape and become an invasive species. Buckthorn is a huge issue here in the upper Midwest. Some of you all, maybe if you've taken Dr. Juno's classes, have actually gone out and dealt with buckthorn, tried to clear it from forest areas and those kinds of things. So again, it's a challenge that our communities face. So why do we need to think about hazards? If these are natural events, right, particularly wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, they're part of the ecosystem, they're part of the events. Why do we need to worry about them? There are some positives that come from these events, right? So flooding restores habitat and fertility in soil. what makes in Egypt, right? The Nile floods every year, and that annual flooding along the Nile actually has made Egypt one of the most fertile areas in the world up until the building of dams that controlled those floods. Because as the floods happened, it would bring new soil and nutrients down from the mountains into the floodplain of the Nile. The water would rise up, it would flood those areas, it would deposit that those nutrients and that new soil onto the floodplain. Waters would recede, and the farmers could then plant and have those nutrients, and it was cycled every year, so the soil didn't deplete like it often does without those floods. Fires are required by some tree species to reproduce, keeps the underbrush and competition under control. When you have regular low intensity fires, it's actually good for the forest because it clears out weeds and underbrush and takes out the buildup of dead trees. So, trees fall when they die. A low intensity fire would burn out that underbrush and that buildup of fuel on a regular basis, so you didn't have a high intensity buildup of fuel. And what's happened now, since we've gone to this approach of fighting fires, instead of allowing that sort of natural low intensity fire to happen, we go in, we fight the fire, and that allows fuel to build up. So when fires do happen now, there's a lot more fuel for them, and it makes those fires more intense and more damaging than they otherwise would be without human intervention. So in many cases now, we're learning that allowing fires to burn is actually good because it does that work of clearing out the fuel and maintaining the forest ecosystem more effectively than when we fight the fires, allowing that fuel to build up. And we have growing population in vulnerable areas. So what we see is that more people are moving to coastlines, particularly where they are more susceptible to threats, certainly hurricanes, flooding, those kinds of things. We're moving out into more rural areas where wildfires are a bigger threat. And so we're seeing significant challenges arise just because of our behavior and where we're choosing to live. And we're pretty bad at assessing risk. We tend to be more scared of those things that are less likely to kill us. So the question there is if you're afraid of flying, right? You're far more likely to die in the car driving to the airport than you are on the airplane itself. So this infographic, this is for the UK. So, but the data is basically the same for the United States, except that our transport accidents are a higher percentage here in the United States. Car wrecks kill pretty good number of people here in the United States. But main things that kill us: heart and circulatory disorders, cancers, respiratory disorders, basic lifestyle diseases. A lot of those are that we've talked about. Diabetes is right up in there, accidents of various kinds. But you can kind of see, we tend to be worried about things like, terrorism and war and those kinds of things, but they're pretty minor on terms of what's actually going to kill us. And here's the risk factors, right? So things that lead to death: high blood pressure, smoking, high cholesterol, obesity. Those behavioral indicators are significant causes of death. Low fruits and vegetables, so basically bad nutrition, which we talked about: food deserts and lack of access to healthy foods, but also the personal choice and responsibility of choosing to eat healthy foods contributes to our risk factors. And obviously now too, we have coronavirus, which is, certainly a threat for some of us. But we tend to fear those high, low likelihood, high impact events. Things like airplane crashes. Those kill a lot of people at one time, but really, if you look at it, we basically kill an airplane full of people every day in our cars, but we're not afraid of driving our cars. Anyways, I've kind of lost my train of thought here. So carrying on, risk is hazard times vulnerability, right? So our risk is basically how likely a hazard is to happen, and our vulnerability to that hazard. So if we live in a house On the coastline, right, the hazard we face is a hurricane. And our vulnerability is the fact that our home is built right on the coast, right on the beach, and maybe it's not elevated. So if we do get a hurricane coming in, we are at high risk because our house is not designed to accommodate the flooding that would come from a hurricane, right? So, so that's how we determine risk in terms of natural hazards. And this is what it looks like. So you can see where we have areas of high risk are certainly along the coast. Where we have the high risk of hurricanes is the largest source of hazard along the coast. And hurricanes bring high winds, they bring flooding, they bring tornadoes. There's a lot of potential harm from a tornado. On the west coast, it's largely wildfires and earthquakes that are um, the natural hazards in that area. You also have very high population densities, and so there's a large population at risk from the hazards that can occur in that area. If you look here in the Midwest, right, you can kind of follow basically the river, and so the risk is basically of flooding in much of the Midwest area. You also have some threat from earthquakes in the central part of the country. There was a massive earthquake in the 1800s that was big enough to actually reverse the flow of the Mississippi River. Happened right around St. Louis. So it's been a couple hundred years since that happened, but that risk still exists. This is Flash Flood Alley here in Texas. So you can kind of see that area of central Texas. There's Austin where I'm at. And you also have tornadoes. So you have Tornado Alley here in the Midwest. And then up closer to us, you've got flooding, some risk of tornadoes, and those are kind of the primary risks. But again, the coastal areas are those areas really at high risk because of the population densities and the potential for hurricanes and the like. So there's different forms of risk that we have to deal with and we have to consider when we start talking about how we respond to these hazards. So first and foremost is your physical risk just from living in a hazardous area, right? You are in danger if you live in a tornado-prone neighborhood or community. You're in physical danger if you live in a place prone to earthquakes or hurricanes or whatever. So your personal risk, so things like your age, your gender, your education, all of that influences your risk. So right now with coronavirus, certainly if you are an older person, um, older men seem to be the ones at the highest risk from coronavirus. If you smoke, um, that certainly will contribute to your personal risk. So that's your individual um, threat or the individual vulnerability to a threat based on those characteristics. Economics adds to risk. So people who are low income oftentimes live in more vulnerable neighborhoods. So we certainly saw that with Katrina in New Orleans, right? The neighborhoods that had the worst flooding and the worst impact from Katrina were those low income neighborhoods because they lived in the lowest part of the city, right? They lived in the areas most at risk from flooding. It reduces your options for evacuation potentially. If you don't have a car or maybe a non-reliable car that could get you out of an area at risk if a hurricane's coming or something like that. Certainly limits your opportunities. We're seeing with coronavirus, millions and millions of people are losing their jobs, and so they're not going to have income during this threat when people are locked up in their homes. So they're going to be more at risk for food insecurity. They're going to be more at risk to the health impacts of higher stress. All of that contributes, and all of that's based on people's economics. So our structural risks include, poor quality buildings, poor design neighborhoods, those lifelines. We don't have the capacity to evacuate, to get people out of harm's way. Maybe the medical system in your community is if you're in rural areas, we've lost dozens or hundreds of rural hospitals across the country in the last few years. So you don't have access to medical care in your community. You have to travel. And again, if you're low income, right, paying for a tank of gas to go get medical care can be a barrier for you. So those structural challenges increase people's risks. Political risk, lack of access to information and resources. So again, Low-income minority populations are often less able to access necessary services and care. Institutional. We see less of this in the U.S., but in some areas we do see things like a lack of enforcement of building codes. So buildings are built unsafely, so they're more vulnerable when a hazard happens to collapse or flooding or those kinds of things. If communities don't enforce floodplain regulations and allow construction in flood-prone areas, all of those are increase vulnerability and increase the threat from natural hazards. So any of or all of these may be present. So we have to think holistically when we start thinking about a response to hazards. We need to look at the big picture and look at all of these different elements of risks to ensure that we're addressing all of the potential vulnerabilities in our communities when we start doing our risk assessment. So the hazards assessment, we need to think about what are the natural hazards that can occur in the area? What are the human-caused hazards in the area? So, the picture here of a nuclear plant. We haven't had any deaths from nuclear accidents in the United States, but people are still pretty paranoid about nuclear power, and we've had a few incidents. 3 Mile Island back in '79 is probably the biggest and most commonly talked about in the United States. Obviously, we had Chernobyl in the UK, or in the Ukraine, not the UK, sorry, the Ukraine, when it was still part of the USSR, the Soviet Union back in the 80s, 86, I think. And then, of course, more recently in 2011, the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster caused by a tsunami. So a natural disaster causing, a human related disaster, I guess, in 2011. But those are certainly threats from human activity that we need to consider. So we need to look at what are the causes of these disasters. So obviously hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, those are all out of human control. But those human-caused disasters are things we can potentially limit. So we can look at how we design and locate things like nuclear plants or chemical factories, refineries, those kinds of things. We can think about how we design and build those facilities to mitigate the potential harm from them. We can have adequate regulations in place on things like our fertilizer plants, like the one in West Texas that blew up and killed a bunch of people, and make sure that they're operating in a safe manner. All of those things, we can limit causes in some cases. And the people involved with this kind of planning, this kind of assessment, are your public safety officials, engineers, environmental scientists, etc. Right? So a broad range of people are engaged in this process to identify and assess the hazards and the potential vulnerabilities, and come up with strategies on how to mitigate those vulnerabilities. So what is the threat posed by the hazards? So certainly when you're looking at things like hurricanes, right? The threat and the potential magnitude of a hurricane is with the flooding, with the wind, with tornadoes and other issues that are spawned by hurricanes. We need to think about what the potential impact is from that. What's the potential harm to people, harm to infrastructure, harm to other assets? So what is our vulnerability to the physical threats caused from this particular hazard? And how vulnerable are people and things to hazards in this area? So picture on the right here is a home in a forested area, right? And so the vulnerability here in this home is actually reduced because they've adopted design standards and landscaping around their home that actually reduces the threat from wildfire. So we can actually look at how we design spaces to become less vulnerable to hazards. So we need to think about notification and awareness of threats. So here on campus, we have alert messages that come from the university telling us, when there's tornadoes, other natural hazards, potentially, God forbid, an active shooter situation, we would be notified and told, how to deal with that. Thinking about the ability to evacuate. So where do people have the capacity to evacuate themselves? If we're moving low income people may not have access to a car. So do we have a way to get those folks out of harm's way if they don't have access to a vehicle? What are our response capabilities? Do we have adequate public safety personnel to respond to a wildfire or a tornado to make sure that we can get there and fight the fires that are burning, save homes, save commercial properties, and so forth? Can we rescue people that are in need of rescue and so forth? As we're seeing with coronavirus now, the potential threat from coronavirus isn't necessarily individual deaths. It's the fact that so many people will need care that it will overwhelm our medical system. The capacity of our hospitals with respirators, beds, just space for all the people who will potentially need care is we don't have adequate capacity to deal with the potential number of people who will be sick and will require all that care. We're seeing stories of a lack of personal protective equipment for the caregivers who are responsible for treating people aren't potentially adequately able to protect themselves from being infected. So all of these things show a lack of capability in our response to coronavirus. So it's all stuff that we're seeing now kind of live in person, which is sort of terrifying, but we'll get through it, hopefully. Sorry. We have to think about the recurrence. How often does this happen? So you probably all heard the term 100-year flood, right? So, we can expect a flood of this magnitude once every 100 years. That's not really what that term means. It's actually basically there's a 1% chance that it can happen in any given year. So you can have 100-year floods multiple times in one year. You can have back to back. It can happen more frequently than just every 100 years, but it's just a term that's commonly used to define the recurrence of that level of a flood. You can look at meteorological records. So we've been tracking temperature, we've been tracking rainfall for a long time, and you can look back over that and kind of see patterns of temperature changes, rainfall, those kinds of things over time. Historical documents speak of, the little ice age during the medieval period. We see that there was some temperature fluctuation in that period from the historical records. Sorry. You can also look at natural evidence. So tree rings, you can see tree rings fluctuate with how dry or wet a particular season is. Tree rings are laid down every year, and so you can see in this picture here the 16th century mega drought. So during that period, you can see that the tree rings are very, 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 very small, and that's an indication that there was a prolonged period with very little rain. And so you can actually see that in the record. And so then you can correlate that with historical documents and other records to understand the conditions that were happening at that time. Additionally, you can see things like ash lines and geological formations. So this picture here, this light line, this yellow layer here, is volcanic ash. And so you can use that to indicate, obviously, there was a significant period of volcanic activity to lay down a layer of ash that thick. And so, again, that can show indications of disasters and hazards that have occurred in the past. And then you start to think about your vulnerability. So, what is our exposure to potential hazards? How vulnerable are we? What's at risk, or how at risk are we to a particular hazard? So you want to think about the population in the area. So education, income, mobility, health, all those characteristics are going to influence the vulnerability of that population. So again, if you're thinking about trying to evacuate people, do most people in the community have their own cars? Are we going to have to bring in buses or some other form of transportation for folks in the neighborhood to get them to safety? Do we have elderly people? The story, I'm not going to click on it because it's not that important. I mean, it's just an example from Rita. So Hurricane Rita was coming to Texas, and it was shortly after Katrina, so everybody was super on edge about the threat from hurricanes. So Rita was coming through, and they were evacuating much of the Houston area. Houston's the fourth largest city in the country, huge population on the move, and more people actually died in the evacuation than were killed by the storm itself. So, in the example of the story that I'm not going to click on, I think 27 people, senior citizens, died on a bus that caught on fire as they were being evacuated from their senior living facility. So we need to think about that, right? The threat of a natural hazard is enormous, but the potential harm, if we don't do the evacuation right, can actually be more dangerous in some cases than the hazard itself. So we need to have evacuation plans and the adequate equipment to move people in the event of these hazards. What is the internal capacity of the population to respond to a disaster? Do people have, they say everyone should have 3 days worth of food and water in their home at all times, right? Just so if there is something that happens, you have at least a couple days worth of supplies to, you know, survive before you can either leave or get help from some other form. Obviously, we've seen with this coronavirus people acting like idiots and buying up all the toilet paper and just generally acting stupid, and buying up stuff that they're never going to be able to eat before it spoils, or they're going to be sitting on toilet paper for the rest of their lives, because of their panic buying. So people with money are doing much better than people without money. If you just lost your job, you might be wondering, how do I buy enough food to shelter in place if I have to? So your capacity to respond may be limited. And what has been done prior to the disaster to minimize potential harm? So things like building codes and restrictions. Have we kept people from building in the floodplain so that we don't have to deal with, we don't have homes in the floodplain that'll flood when that happens. We don't, we have in place regulations so when people do build in rural areas, they're building in such a way that they minimize their risk from wildfire, right? All of those things are ways that we can mitigate vulnerability prior to a disaster happening. And we start to identify how do we reduce vulnerabilities going forward. So the next lecture will really focus on this idea of resilience and reducing vulnerability. Wow, that's all I got for today. So what I want y'all to think about, as we are currently in the midst of a natural disaster, I want y'all to think about how you're responding to it, how your community is responding to it, how your neighborhood is responding to it. What are some ways that you're reducing your own vulnerability? How are, maybe you're helping out your neighbors. Maybe y'all and your neighbors are sharing, staples if you need particular food, or maybe somebody does have some extra toilet paper they're sharing with you. But think about how this disaster that we're living through right now is impacting your life and what it might mean for you going forward in terms of assessing your own vulnerability and also working to minimize your own vulnerability to future crises, as we're living through one right now. So that's it for this edition. I will talk to you soon with another. Take care.